Service Teardown, HP280G4, small form factor. How to replace the side panel. Removal. Place the unit on its side, with the removable side panel facing up. Loosen the T15 Torx head captive thumb screw at the rear of the side panel that secures it to the unit. Grasp the metal tab at the rear of the side panel and pull it slightly backward. Lift the side panel up and away from the unit. Replacement. Note the side panel has several tabs on its edges, which fit into slots under the front lip of the chassis. It also has a small slot on the rear edge, which the lock slot on the unit slides into. Align the tabs with the corresponding slots on the chassis, and place the side panel into position on the unit. Slide the side panel forward until the lock slot at the rear of the unit fits through the small slot on the rear edge of the side panel. Tighten the T15 Torx head captive thumb screw to secure the side panel to the unit. How to replace the optical drive. Before you begin, remove the side panel. Removal. Disconnect the SATA data and power cables from the optical drive. Press the green drive release latch at the rear of the optical drive and slide the optical drive out through the front of the unit. If you are installing a new optical drive, pull the green drive release latch off of the optical drive. Insert a straightened paper clip or other similar tool into the force eject aperture on the optical drive to eject the drive tray. Pry and push out on the tab securing the bezel to the optical drive. And remove the bezel from the drive. Replacement. If you are installing a new optical drive, align the tabs on the bezel from the old optical drive with the new drive, and press the bezel until the tabs are secured. There are 3 small pins on the green drive release latch that slot into 3-pin holes on the side of the optical drive. Press the latch pins into their pinholes to secure the latch to the new optical drive. Slide the optical drive into its drive bay through the front of the unit. Until the green release latch clicks into place. Connect the SATA power and data cables to the optical drive. How to replace the front bezel. Before you begin, remove the side panel and the optical drive if installed. Removal. Pull up the 3 plastic tabs to release the front bezel from the chassis. Grasp either edge of the front bezel and pull gently backwards, away from the chassis. Remove the front bezel. Replacement. Align the 4 hooks located at the side edge of the front bezel with their slots on the unit. Push the front bezel forward, towards the chassis, until the 3 plastic tabs click into place. How to replace the hard drive cage. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, and the front bezel. Removal. Press the release tab that secures the hard drive cage to the chassis, and lift the hard drive cage up to a 30-degree angle. Caution: to prevent damage to the cables, do not open the hard drive cage fully. Disconnect the SATA power and data cables from the hard disk drive. Swing the hard drive cage to an upright position and lift it off of the unit. Replacement. Align the 3 metal tabs at the rear of the hard drive cage with their slots on the chassis. Place the metal tabs in their slots and swing the hard drive cage down to a 30-degree angle. Reconnect the SATA power and data cables to the hard disk drive. Press the drive cage down until the 2 metal tabs on the side of the drive cage fit into their slots on the chassis. How to replace the hard disk drive. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Remove the 4 T15 Torx head screws that secure the hard disk drive to the hard drive cage. Grasp the front of the hard disk drive and slide it out of the hard drive cage and remove. Replacement. Grasp the front edges of the hard disk drive and slide it into the hard drive cage. Replace the 4 T15 Torx head screws that secure the hard disk drive to the hard drive cage. How to replace the M.2 solid-state drive. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Remove the single P1 Phillips head screw that secures the M.2 solid-state drive to the motherboard and allow it to release to the spring tension position. Grasp the M.2 solid-state drive by the edges and pull gently to remove it. Replacement. Align the notch in the M.2 solid-state drive with the key in the M.2 solid-state drive slot on the motherboard. At a 30-degree angle, insert the M.2 solid-state drive into its slot on the motherboard. While holding down the M.2 solid-state drive, replace the P1 Phillips head screw that secures it to the motherboard. How to replace the wireless LAN board. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Disconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN board by grasping the connector with a small pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers. Caution. Use care when disconnecting the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN board. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. Remove the P1 Phillips head screw that secures the wireless LAN board to the motherboard and allow it to rise to the spring tension position. Grasp the wireless LAN board by the edges and pull gently to remove it. Replacement. Align the notch on the wireless LAN board with the key in the wireless LAN board slot on the motherboard. At a 30-degree angle, gently insert the wireless LAN board into its slot on the motherboard. Replace the P1 Phillips head screw to secure the wireless LAN board to the motherboard. Connect the wireless LAN antenna cable to the wireless LAN board. How to replace the memory module. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Simultaneously push down the retaining lever located on each side of the memory slot to release the memory module. Pull the memory module out of the memory slot. Replacement. Align the small notch on the bottom of the memory module with the key in the memory slot on the motherboard. Press the memory module into the memory slot until the retaining levers snap into position over the sides of the module. How to replace the graphic card. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Lift the latch of the expansion card's retaining bracket and rotate it outwards. Push sideways on the retaining lever of the expansion slot on the motherboard. Carefully pull out the graphic card. Replacement. Carefully align and push the graphic card into its expansion slot on the motherboard until it is fully seated. Lift and push the expansion card's retaining bracket back into place to secure the card. How to replace the fan duct. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Remove the CPU power cable from the cable guides on the fan duct. Simultaneously push back the retaining tab on each side of the fan duct to release it. Pull the fan duct up and out of the unit. Replacement. There are two small ledges on the inside of the fan duct that rest under the top edge of the heatsink fan. Align the fan duct in its position over the heatsink fan. Insert the fan duct and press it down firmly until the tabs snap into place over the edge of the heatsink fan. Route the CPU power cable through the cable guides on the fan duct. How to replace the power supply. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard drive cage, and the fan duct. Removal. Press the release tab to disconnect the CPU power cable from the motherboard. Disconnect the power supply command cable from the motherboard. Press the release tab to disconnect the main power cable from the motherboard. Remove the 4 T15 Torx head screws that secure the power supply to the rear of the chassis. Press the release latch at the front bottom edge of the power supply. Then grasp the power supply and slide it away from the rear chassis before fully removing it from the unit. Caution! Before removing the power supply, make sure there are no other cables tangled with the power supply cables. Replacement. There is a slot on the side of the power supply that slides over a large tab on the sidewall of the chassis. Align the power supply slot slightly behind the chassis tab and lower the power supply into the chassis. Slide the power supply back until it locks into place behind the release latch. Replace the 4 T15 Torx head screws that secure the power supply to the rear of the chassis. Connect the main power cable to the motherboard. Connect the power supply command cable to the motherboard. Connect the CPU power cable to the motherboard. How to replace the wireless LAN antenna. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive, if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Removal. Disconnect the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN board by grasping the connector with a small pair of needle nose pliers or tweezers. Caution! Use care when disconnecting the wireless LAN antenna cable from the wireless LAN board. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. Remove the antenna cable from the routing channel inside the chassis, and then feed it through the access hole in the front of the chassis. Remove the antenna cable from the cable guides on the front of the chassis. Remove the T15 Torx head screw that secures the antenna to the front of the chassis, and remove the antenna. Replacement. The antenna sits on an alignment pin on the front of the chassis. Place the antenna onto its alignment pin and replace the T15 Torx head screw that secures the antenna to the front of the chassis. Route the antenna cable along the routing channel on the front of the chassis. And feed it through the access hole. Route the antenna cable along the routing channel inside the chassis to the wireless LAN board. Connect the antenna cable to the wireless LAN board. Caution: use care when connecting the wireless LAN antenna cable to the wireless LAN board. A damaged cable or connector can degrade desktop performance. How to replace the heatsink fan. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard drive cage, and the fan duct. Removal. Disconnect the heatsink fan cable from the motherboard. Loosen the 4 captive T15 Torx head screws that secure the heatsink to the motherboard. Gently pull the heatsink out of the PC. Replacement. Note: before replacing the heatsink, the thermal grease should be replaced. The thermal grease should be replaced every time the heatsink is removed. Use alcohol and a soft cloth, or an alcohol swab, to clean all thermal grease off of the heatsink and the CPU. Use the thermal grease applicator to apply new thermal grease to the CPU. Align the 4 screws of the heatsink over the 4 screw holes on the motherboard, with the connector aligned towards the top of the unit. Tighten the 4 captive T15 Torx head screws that secure the heatsink to the motherboard. Connect the heatsink fan cable to the motherboard. How to replace the CPU. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard drive cage, the fan duct, and the heatsink. Removal. Gently press down the CPU load lever, and then push it to the side, away from the CPU socket, to allow it to rise to the spring-loaded position. Lift the load plate off of the socket. Grasp the edges of the CPU and carefully remove it from its socket. Replacement. Hold the CPU over its socket in the motherboard and align the golden triangle at the corner with the corresponding triangle marked on the motherboard. Place the CPU into its socket on the motherboard. Swing the load plate down onto the socket. Push the CPU load lever down and then sideways to secure the CPU. How to replace the motherboard. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, the hard drive cage, memory modules, M.2 solid-state drive, wireless LAN board, the fan duct, the expansion cards, the heatsink, and the CPU. Removal. Important. To prevent damage to the motherboard and the cables, disconnect all the cables perpendicular to the motherboard. Disconnect all cables from the motherboard, noting their location for reinstallation. Remove the 7 T15 Torx head screws that secure the motherboard to the chassis. Partially lift the front of the motherboard upwards. Carefully slide the motherboard to the front of the chassis to release the connectors from the rear I/O panel. Lift the rear edge of the motherboard and carefully pull it out of the chassis. Replacement. Important. Before replacing the motherboard, you must first restore the CMOS factory settings. Grasp the motherboard by the edges and carefully insert the front edge of the motherboard at an angle to the chassis. Lower the motherboard onto the chassis and align it with the metal tabs on the chassis. Tow the rear I/O connectors onto the rear I/O panel until the motherboard sits snugly in place. Replace the 7 T15 Torx head screws to secure the motherboard to the chassis. Connect all cables to the motherboard. Note, after reassembling the desktop, you need to enter the system BIOS and reset the time and date settings in the BIOS. How to restore CMOS to factory settings. Before you begin, remove the side panel, the optical drive if installed, the front bezel, and the hard drive cage. Important: CMOS factory settings should be restored as a first step before replacing the motherboard. Steps: remove the battery from the motherboard. Wait 30 seconds. Replace the battery to the motherboard. CMOS factory settings are now reset. Important: you will now need to enter System BIOS and reset the clock in BIOS after this procedure.